Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we call the presidential horse race and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. A major loss for Donald Trump this week. In Wisconsin, GOP primary voters soundly rejected him, giving Trump 35% of the vote to Ted Cruz's 48%. Kasich got just 14% and no delegates. Exit polls showed more than half the Wisconsin GOP voters are worried, even scared, of a Trump nomination, and about a third are ready to defect from the GOP if he wins. The prize that Cruz now claims is within his reach is the nomination.
As a result of the people of Wisconsin defying the media, defying the pundits, I am more and more convinced that our campaign is going to earn the 1,237 delegates needed to win the Republican nomination.
Bernie Sanders also scored a major victory in Wisconsin, his sixth over Hillary Clinton in the last 7 contests. Sanders told supporters in Wyoming, the next state to vote, that big changes he wants are not at all unrealistic, something critics accuse him of. They are realistic, he said, if people stand up and fight. And he gave this example of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour.
Somebody stood up 5 years ago and said that. The person next to them would have said, "You're nuts. $15 an hour? You want to more than double the minimum wage? You're crazy. Maybe we get it up to $8, $9 an hour, but $15 an hour, you're dreaming too big." Sound familiar?
Both Clinton and Trump, by the way, decided not to go before the press after Tuesday's defeats, but the Trump campaign did accuse Cruz of illegally coordinating with an anti-Trump PAC and claim Cruz is acting as a Trojan horse for the party bosses to steal the nomination. What else did the candidates say or stumble over this past week? Well, Trump warned that the country is on the verge of a massive recession that he could prevent, and he vowed to make personal money transfers to Mexico illegal, personal transfers, unless their government pays $5 or $10 billion for his wall. Also, a few days after Trump said, then retracted, that women should be punished for having abortions, Clinton also tripped on abortion, saying, quote, "The unborn person doesn't have constitutional rights." Maybe she meant fetus rather than person from a pro-choice perspective. And in an interview with the New York Daily News, Sanders seemed less than informed about who has the power to break up the big banks, a signature issue for him. We'll delve into banking and Wall Street in a few minutes with New York Times columnist Gretchen Morgenson. Sanders' campaign, by the way, has plenty in the bank right now. Last month, he outraised Hillary by $15 million. He received a total of $44 million. All right, with only 12 more election days left before the primaries are concluded, let's look more closely at the candidates jockeying for position. Yes, time for the horse race. It was a good day for Republican nominee Ted Cruz Tuesday, as we said, as he showed that he could win where frontrunner Donald Trump usually dominates. Cruz bested Trump by double digits in suburban and urban areas, giving the candidate new hope as he heads into the more densely populated Northeast and Mid-Atlantic primary states. Cruz continued to narrow Trump's lead, which now stands at 226 delegates. Just 882 delegates remain. It was a bad night for Trump, who added just 6 delegates to his tally, as he failed to show that he can grow much beyond his core group of supporters. But as the never-Trump strategy settled in with voters, John Kasich continued to fade. He failed to garner any delegates in Wisconsin, as we mentioned, and Trump has yet to win a 51% majority in any state, but he may be able to finally break through in New York. Trump is currently polling above 50% there. He has also been performing well in blue congressional districts where the few Republicans live, but many delegates hang in the balance. According to the New York election rules, if Trump gets more than 50% of the statewide vote and congressional district vote, he would take home all of New York's 95 delegates, eclipsing Ted Cruz's Wisconsin win and dramatically altering the race once again. And who are these delegates we keep hearing so much about? Well, according to polling expert Nate Silver, Elected delegates will mostly be activists and local party leaders sympathetic to Cruz, and not Washington establishment candidates like Paul Ryan and John Kasich, should the convention be contested. Unbound Republican delegates have already been shown to be susceptible to Cruz's strong ground game. This past weekend, Cruz was able to undercut Trump and collect 18 out of 25 such delegates in North Dakota. In Colorado, where 2 congressional districts held elections, Cruz picked up 6 more. There will be many more unbound delegates to fight over, as those pledged to candidates who have dropped out will be freed up, and as even more unpledged delegates are elected. In Pennsylvania alone, 54 out of the state's yet to be determined 71 delegates will be unpledged. On the Democratic side, Wisconsin was a big win for Bernie Sanders, as he performed better than polls expected to cap a 6-race winning streak. With Wisconsin's outcome, Sanders narrowed the gap in pledged delegates to just 252, results that should be more than enough to keep the conversation going and the money rolling in. With Sanders' recent run, he's been able to narrow his Real Clear Politics national polling average with Clinton to just 6 points, further helping to breathe new life into his momentum narrative. But the delegate math continues to be a problem for the Vermont senator, and his path will continue to be rough as upcoming primaries move into more diverse states traditionally more favorable to Clinton. This includes delegate-rich New York, where she, more so than Sanders, will be battling on home turf. Bernie thinks we still use subway tokens here, he told the Daily News. And Sanders won't be benefiting as much from independents, as they will be shut out from upcoming closed primary states like New York, where only registered Democrats may vote. Okay, let's step back a bit. Behind all the talk of contested conventions and disaffected voters are battles over policy. Joining us, Manhattan Institute Senior Fellow and former Domestic Policy Director for the 2012 Romney campaign, Oren Cass. Oren has been instrumental in steering the conservative conversation on climate, poverty, and energy, and has a lot to say about the future of the Republican Party. Hi, Oren. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So I see in an article you wrote, you called Trump a crypto-fascist. So what do we learn about the Republican electorate if so many people voting in the primaries are willing to vote for a crypto-fascist?
Well, we learned that there are a lot of people in the party who maybe aren't as focused on what conservatives, I think, have always thought of as core values. You know, people often assume conservative equals Republican, liberal equals Democrat, but political parties are more than that. And actually, a lot of Trump supporters are historically Democrats who have more recently moved into the Republican Party. And I think what we see is coalitions that are shifting in the country, and a group of especially lower income, less educated, typically white voters who are now in the Republican Party, many who left the Democratic Party, and who find Trump's message more appealing than the traditional conservative message.
So are we becoming more like Europe, where we can see surges on both sides of the aisle in primaries for a Le Pen-style nativist, to put it in the context of France, and a democratic socialist who might fit better in Scandinavia?
I think maybe some of the same forces that are encouraging those things in Europe are playing out in the United States to some degree. There are a couple of things that will keep the U.S. different. Maybe most important is that our political system pretty much ties us to 2 parties. You can have a much wider range of parties in a lot of European countries, each do fairly well. Especially at the presidential level, it's never really going to work to have more than 2 serious candidates. And so I think what you'll see is what we're seeing this time, and which isn't actually that uncommon, to see the fringes of the parties sometimes do fairly well in the primary, but for the most part at the end of the day to have a more conventional standard bearer. And then every now and then, whether it's a Goldwater or a McGovern or strange things pop up, that's certainly not new for this country either.
There seemed to be a moment, maybe a month to 3 months ago, where when Trump was more on the rise, it seemed like the coalition, the basic coalition in American politics could be shifting, where some of those populists who might have also gone for Sanders, who are skeptical of the establishment, who are negative on trade, could be convinced to be negative on immigration, might actually become Trump Republicans. He's turned off so much of the rest of the country in other ways that no longer seems the case. But do you think that the current coalitions, the coalitions of the last 20 years, maybe more, that make up the Republican Party, are enough to propel it to a victory that your guy Mitt Romney couldn't win in 2012?
Well, I think if you look at what's happening in the Republican Party right now, it's important to separate two elements of Trump. There's the Trump policy platform, which differs in a lot of ways from a traditional conservative platform, especially on an issue like trade. And those might be perfectly viable positions that are going to become increasingly prevalent in the Republican Party, maybe in the Democratic Party as well. You also have Trump the politician, who is a uniquely toxic personality, for better and worse. I think it's helped propel him, but we're also seeing now that it's helping put a ceiling on him. And so I think we're seeing the beginning of the end of Trump the personality as a credible force. But Trump the policy platform, I think, is going to be more influential going forward because there's clearly a pretty large constituency that's thinking about things that way.
Wisconsin seemed pretty key in kind of sealing the deal that no candidate will go to the convention in Cleveland this summer with a majority of delegates. If you agree with that, what happens next?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's certainly possible still for Trump to get the majority, though at this point, definitely less likely than more likely.
He'd need about 60% of remaining delegates, and he has not yet won more than 50% in any election. I realize some of the states are winner take all, so he could win 35, 40% of a state and get all the delegates and do it that way, but it is unlikely.
Exactly, and it would take something like what you described in New York, where he essentially runs the table. But flip side is this season in particular, we've learned never say never. But it certainly seems likely that Trump will not get there with enough pledged delegates. And if that's the case, what we've seen from the Cruz team is that the overwhelming majority of the actual people in the building are likely to be Cruz supporters rather than Trump supporters. And what that means is on a first ballot, where you have to vote based on what your state decided, you're not likely to get a majority. And then the second ballot, for the most part, is up to what the people in the room think. And based on where we're headed right now, the people in the room are going to choose Cruz.
And that's different than what the party leaders supposedly want, too. Cruz was supposed to be the conservative, right-wing, fire-breathing, anti-establishment candidate until Trump came along and went even further in that direction. But the idea of replacing both of them with a Paul Ryan or a Kasich, or there are some other names that get mentioned, even Romney, it seems unlikely based on Nate Silver's count of where the delegates' loyalties actually are.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in a sense, there are two flavors of contested convention. You could imagine a world where Rubio was still in the race, where Kasich was doing well, and you were going to get there with four guys with between 20 and 30% of the delegates each. In that kind of situation, not only do you not get anywhere on the first ballot, but then you have a second ballot, a third ballot. The group can't get to a majority, and that's when the scenario of the white knight starts to make more sense. If you have a situation where one of the last two guys actually has gotten enough people into the room, it's pretty hard to make a case for the white knight.
On the other hand, on sort of the pro-Trump side, even though he lost by 13 points to Cruz and he only got 35% of the vote, 55% told exit pollsters in Wisconsin that the nomination should go to whichever candidate gets to Cleveland with the most delegates, even if that's not a majority. That means a lot of people, 20 points worth of people who did not vote for Trump, think he would be the rightful nominee if they get that far, and he's leading even with not a majority. Does that put a lot of pressure on the party to go with Trump?
I'm not sure it does. I think if the party looks ahead to November, which would be the ultimate way it could put pressure on them, the reality is that Trump already, and by July even more so, is clearly going to be the bigger disaster as a nominee for the future of the party. And so that consideration is going to outweigh the concern about alienating the Trump voters. Either you have to alienate the Trump voters or the non-Trump voters. Either way, it's going to be very painful for the party this cycle. But given those two choices and given where America more broadly is, I think it's a pretty easy choice for the party.
Because people say it's not really democracy. If you hold all these primaries and somebody goes into Cleveland with, let's say, a couple of hundred delegate lead, and the party leaders decide they can do something else, is it democracy?
Well, the primary system is a political party system. It's the rules that each party designs for choosing their nominee to put up into the democratic election. And certainly the party has a lot of reasons for wanting to be democratic in the way they choose. But at the end of the day, the party also wants to have rules in place that are good for the party. And that plays out in all sorts of ways. The timing of the primaries, the rules for the allocation of delegates, the rules for binding them. And if those rules all add up to making sure Donald Trump doesn't get the nomination, I think you'll have to say the rules played a pretty important function.
You're a policy guy more than a politics guy. How much do you think the Republicans as a group, those who are left, are emphasizing the right policies, even the right topics, on the campaign trail?
Well, I mean, I think policy is pretty much out the window at this point on the Republican side in particular. You know, policy always has a role to play, but especially in the primaries, a fairly small role. If you think about what the party's trying to do, it's a party because it mostly agrees on the policy. It's more trying to choose who will be the standard bearer of that policy. So you tend to have a few fights, but much more focus on the personalities. And given the strength and importance of the personalities in this instance, things like who's willing to insult somebody else's wife is important and in some sense is very rationally important. You know, as Republicans think about who they want to put up in a general election, that has to be a big consideration, and as opposed to whose top tax rate is higher or lower.
So stay here. We're going to bring on some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. As we approach the April 19th New York primaries, we focus in on one very New York institution that's central to the election, Wall Street. Almost 6 years ago, in July 2010, President Obama signed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. The landmark law was designed to prevent financial institutions from taking the kinds of risks that led to the economic collapse of 2007-2008. But are we really safer now? This is a major debate on the Democratic side. Bernie Sanders says Dodd-Frank is not enough, and we should reinstate Glass-Steagall, a Depression-era regulation that in part restricted banks from taking on both commercial and investment banking. Here's history, according to Bernie Sanders.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed this bill into law precisely to prevent Wall Street speculators from causing another Great Depression. And it worked for more than 5 decades until Wall Street watered it down under President Reagan and killed it under President Clinton. Secretary Clinton says we just need to impose a few more fees and regulations on the financial industry. I disagree.
To Hillary Clinton, reinstating Glass-Steagall alone would not solve the problem.
I have great respect for Senator Sanders' commitment to try to restore Glass-Steagall, but I do not believe that that is enough. And in fact, I don't believe it really addresses a lot of the biggest issues we have. You know, we now have power under the Dodd-Frank legislation to break up banks, and I've said I will use that power if they pose a systemic risk. But I want to go further, because it was investment banks, it was insurance companies, it was mortgage companies, all of which contributed. So let's not just be narrowly focused on one part of the problem. We have a lot of issues with corporate power that have to be addressed. My plan takes us further, and it would do the job.
Well,
Secretary Clinton.
Just last week, the insurance company MetLife got out of being regulated like a big bank in a major court ruling that some say could weaken the law. So what is the impact of Dodd-Frank, and how restrained is Wall Street now? Let's ask Pulitzer Prize-winning business journalist Gretchen Morgenson. She's the co-author of Reckless Endangerment, How Outsized Ambition, Greed, and Corruption Led to Economic Armageddon, and she writes the Fair Game column for the New York Times. Hi, Gretchen.
Hi, Brian.
And Oren Cass is still with us. The MetLife ruling, that's an insurance company, not a bank, and yet people are saying this could signal the end of Dodd-Frank in a meaningful way. What's the significance of the MetLife ruling?
It really isn't the end of Dodd-Frank. What it really means is that the idea of the regulators assigning a too big to fail label on an institution can be challenged and was challenged successfully in the court. And so MetLife was an insurer that was deemed as systemically important.
That's the phrase under the law, systemically important. Is that a euphemism for too big to
That
fail?
is a euphemism for too big to fail.
So
meaning
Hillary
that
Clinton there said, if a bank becomes too big to fail, then they would take action against it. Apparently, Dodd-Frank already has a list of banks that are too big to fail. So is the difference between Clinton and Sanders that he's saying break them up now, and she's saying no, even though the law designates them as too big to fail already?
I think the argument between the two is really more about bank size and what they're willing to, what they believe is dangerous, troublesome, risky about a bank's size and its interconnectedness. And so when Bernie Sanders says he wants to break up the banks, I think what he's saying is he wants to reduce their size, reduce their interconnectedness. And when Hillary Clinton says she wants to maintain this situation where we can deal with it if they become problematic, which is really where we were in 2008. The government did have something to do, and it did it in 2008. That's the difference between the two arguments, I think, is reducing the size and the threat of the banks on the part of Bernie Sanders.
And on the Sanders clip we saw saying to reimpose Glass-Steagall, Paul Krugman wrote in a column in October that, yeah, we should reimpose Glass-Steagall in his opinion, but that wasn't the reason for the financial crisis. Do you agree with your colleague?
Well, I agree that we can't reinstate Glass-Steagall. It is not that simple. We have complex institutions with far-flung operations that had, really were not that way in 1934. So that's a different situation.
But they were that way in 1998.
Correct.
It was only repealed.
That's right. So they were getting bigger, more interconnected, and more far-reaching, yes, as the years went by. But so my disagreement with my colleague, Mr. Krugman, is that you can't do anything about this. I think that you can. I think that, reducing the size of these institutions is a good cause, and their interconnectedness.
So is Dodd-Frank working, in your opinion? I realize that's a complicated question for a yes or no.
I think, I'll tell you, 30,000 feet, I think that it has made our banks less risky. And I'm talking now commercial banks. And I think that we can safely say that they are not as undercapitalized as they were in the years leading up to the crisis. And having more capital means they're more safe and less likely to cause problems. So yes, I think Dodd-Frank has helped the security, the soundness of the banking system, but there's a lot about it that has not yet even been implemented because so many of the rules that were set out by Congress have not yet been written.
And Oren, from the Republican side, they're having an entirely other debate about Dodd-Frank, where the candidates are saying it's too strong and parts of it need to be rolled back, while Clinton and Sanders debate whether it's strong enough. Do you understand the main Republican objection?
Well, I think the problem with Dodd-Frank is in some cases that it's too strong, but really in a lot of cases that it's not responsive. That if you talk about a lot of the things that Dodd-Frank does, it's more using the financial crisis as an opportunity to write one of the country's largest laws, spawning one of the largest sets of regulations in history to hit every other priority. I think, it's almost in a sense like after there's a shooting spree, you hear calls for a series of gun control measures, and then you say, but which of these gun control measures had anything to do with this particular incident? And the answer is typically, well, none of them, but we thought this would be a good time to talk about gun control.
So you think Dodd-Frank doesn't regulate the things that actually pose the risk that came to haunt us in 2008?
In general, it doesn't. I think the the better capital requirements are certainly important, but that's a lot easier to do than everything else in Dodd-Frank. And I think, an easy way to look at it, and I don't know what your view on this is, but if Dodd-Frank, as passed and at least rule written to this point, existed in 2007, would that have even made a difference? I mean, would that have in any way prevented the investment banks, which were not among the biggest banks and were not commercial banks, from placing the kinds of bets they did, from writing the kinds of policies they did, and building the kinds of connections that they did? And I think it's hard to prove Dodd-Frank stops it.
Well, I think in one particular area I can come up with that it absolutely would be different, and that's in credit default swaps. Much more transparent now with these derivatives that blew up AIG and that almost blew up the whole country. Okay, so we now know a lot more about who's trading those, and there's margin, there's money put aside in case of a failure. So I think that's a perfect example of a pretty narrow and pretty successful part of Dodd-Frank that really did eliminate a very big risk that was posed back then.
Can you explain a little bit of the law to Bernie Sanders as well as our audience? Apparently he got tripped up in an interview with the Daily News editorial board in saying how he would impose Glass-Steagall once again or break up the too-big-to-fail banks. Like, does he need Janet Yellen's permission as leader of the Fed? Is it even clear if he can or how he can?
Well, again, as I said earlier, I think Glass-Steagall is a kind of, it's a meme for reducing the riskiness in the banking system. I don't think you can just bring back that law. That law, I think, was, a very short, concise, compared to Dodd-Frank, very modest law. I don't think you can do that anymore because we didn't have derivatives back then. We didn't have all of these very complex and interrelated institutions. So I think what you have to do, though, is you have to get people behind you who want the risk really taken out of the banking system and have shrewd people saying where that risk lies. Unfortunately, a lot of the regulators in Washington didn't see the risk when it was staring them in the face in 2008, and they're not likely to have learned their lesson and see it staring them in the face now. So you can't rely on the regulators in Washington even to tell you how to do that. This is why this is extremely complex and difficult.
And we just have 10 seconds, but the next threat may not be the same as
it's
the
never
last
the same.
threat that this law tries to correct for.
Correct. It's never exactly, precisely the same. You're right.
And we leave it there. Thank you both. And that's POTUS 2016 for today. We're here each week at this hour calling the presidential horse race and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.